Hey everybody. So this is our last video Q&A for the semester. And today is the last day of class. You did it. Just trying to set my stopwatch so I don't waste y'all's time. So I'm going to, we didn't have a lot of questions submitted this time, so I'm going to go through a few of the remaining questions, and then I'd like to talk to you for just a minute about graduate school. Now I know not everybody is interested in graduate school right now. I've noticed though that many of the graduate students I've worked with through the years were not interested in graduate school when they graduated with an undergraduate degree, but life took them in a direction where they became interested in graduate school. And so this video will probably be up on YouTube for many, many years, so bookmark it and you may return to it at some point in the future. For now though, well actually I've already answered these questions. Yeah, so unfortunately I've already answered all the questions that are here. So let me, or at least the answers that I've given, touch on all the others. Many of these questions overlapped in a beautiful way. I'm glad to know all of you were curious about the same sorts of things in these last chapters. So as your career develops, graduate school might be a good idea. And there are some principles I'd like to talk about when it comes to being qualified for graduate programs, what it is that graduate programs look for. Then I'm going to offer very specifically advice around clinical graduate programs, because as you all know, that's my background. So in general, I'd like to break down what programs look for and what sorts of programs look for these things. The first and most obvious thing that graduate programs look at is your grade point average. So what may surprise you is to learn why it is that graduate programs are interested in grade point average. The prosaic answer is they want to make sure that a student in their graduate program can handle the academic rigors of graduate school, and that is generally true. That it is important that you have a strong academic track record to show that you can handle the kind of coursework you're going to be doing in graduate school. Just between you and I though, the graduate, like when you look at the courses in your junior and senior year, graduate school courses in psychology aren't necessarily more difficult, they're just different. There's a lot of, well, it's like the history and systems class. There's a lot of, here's a bunch of options, please engage in rigorous work around the options that we give you. That's more common in graduate school. There's more writing than there is just multiple choice test taking. But even then, some graduate programs actually feel like undergrad part 2. Another reason, it's kind of a secret reason why GPA is so important, and this will be a theme throughout many of the things graduate directors look for, is 10% of your students cause 90% of your stress. In fact, that's true across fields. Like in the field of business, if you're a salesman, 10% of your customers cause 90% of your stress. If you're the leader of an organization, 10% of the people you're trying to lead cause 90% of your stress. Graduate schools are very motivated to make sure that the people that they're admitting are not one of those 10%. They want to make sure that the people that they're admitting to graduate school are the kind of people who do not complicate faculty's very, very busy, crazy work schedules. Okay? There's a wonderful doggo sitting here saying good morning to me. Hello, wonderful dog. How you doing, my boo? And another wonderful dog. Now we have 2 wonderful dogs here. Wish you guys were here to sit and play with these dogs with me. They are very good dogs. Very friendly. Very snuggly. So, yeah, and where Dad is, there's usually food, right? But I don't have any food here, guys. You're going to be sorely disappointed. So when it comes to grade point average, keep your GPA high. Now, does it mean that your GPA has to be a perfect 4.0? And the answer is no. In fact, although it helps in some ways, 4.0 GPAs are also interesting because 4.0 GPA students aren't necessarily not one of the 10%. In fact, in my experience, like just this semester, I've had various students who have 4.0 GPAs who aren't doing as well in my classes as they'd like, and they're trying to ask me what I can do to maintain their 4.0 GPA, right? They've just become part of the 10% that creates more work for faculty. And believe me, those of us who direct graduate programs know this. And so 4.0 GPAs are like, okay, that's neat, congratulations. And you know, there's also a little red flag with that, is are you going to be one of those that's going to look to the professor to maintain your perfect grades, which isn't what professors are for, and it's a lot of extra work for those professors who try. Now, I don't try to keep other people's GPAs up, I don't see it as my job, but other professors go, oh, you're right, you've accomplished this much, and I'll bend heaven and earth for you, and then the professor's up until 4 a.m. making sure that the student maintains good grades. They're just part of the 10%, right? They're part of the problematic 10%. So I'm not saying if you have a 4.0 GPA to deliberately screw it up. No, please don't. Just be aware that a 4.0 GPA doesn't mean that you're a drama-free student. A 4.0 GPA means that you've worked very hard and you've accomplished this, but it doesn't mean you're not one of the 10% that cause professors extra stress and extra work. So, so there's the issue of grades. Now, I'd like to touch on the issue of research. It's very common, I've noticed, that there is kind of just a party line. If you want to go to graduate school, you have to do research. You know, get involved in research. That is packed with signification. That whole, and the answer is, well, sort of, maybe, depends on what you mean by research, and it depends on the graduate program. So let me actually take those in reverse order. It depends on what you mean by research. Every semester, I'll have several students contact me through the course of a semester saying, hey, can I please come and sit in on your research team because I need that experience for graduate school. And my response is, it's an open meeting. People are willing to come and go as they want, right? I know there are other research teams where you have to apply and actually interview to be a part of that's too much work. And it doesn't save drama. I've noticed it doesn't save work, it creates more work. So it doesn't save hurt feelings, it tends to create hurt feelings. So there's okay, back to the subject of what do we mean by research. The reason why actually engaging in research as an undergraduate is so important for certain graduate programs isn't necessarily because it shows that you're competent in the ways of research. I mean, that's part of it. At the same time, though, at most institutions, many universities, especially those offering graduate programs, faculty are not hired and are not paid for teaching. It's one of the things that makes Utah Valley University kind of a weird organization in many sense, because 70% of our faculty's evaluation towards tenure and promotion is based in teaching. Now, they have to do some research, right? They need to be competent, but their teaching demands are this and their research demands are this. Whereas at other institutions, the research demands are this and the teaching demands are this. That faculty don't get tenure based on the quality of their teaching. In fact, teaching is barely considered at most institutions in terms of whether or not somebody should be granted tenure. In fact, just think of all the institutions I've attended, and I've got a raft load of degrees, and I can't think of a single institution where teaching mattered more than research did. So what faculty are incentivized to do, and this is an unfortunate byproduct of the process, is faculty are incentivized to have research bitches, okay? I don't mean to offend some of you with my prison language, but that's really what it is. Like when my applications for graduate school many hundreds of years ago were being evaluated, the faculty weren't looking at me and going, oh, this is an up-and-coming scholar. This is, he shows great potential to be on his own and get his own grants and things like that. Although that might have been somewhere in the evaluation process. It was like issue number 10 of 10. Instead it was, how can I use this guy as a bitch and profit from his research skills? Like, can I turn over a project to him that I, as a professor, get first author on, and he's the one that does all of the work? And man, that's the way graduate school is for many graduate students. Now, many programs have gotten more ethical, that if a graduate student's doing most of the work, they get first author, but even then that's the exception rather than the rule. So the other thing that it begs is, when you're doing research, what does that mean? Sitting in on a research team does dick. Okay, I'm going to be very, very blunt, because every semester I've got students who come in, they sit in on my research team, they don't do anything, they don't contribute anything, they don't go to conferences with us, they don't write a word, they just sit there, warm butt in a cold seat, and then they document that they're on my research team. It didn't help them get into graduate school. In fact, they don't often get into graduate school because they didn't do anything. Okay, graduate schools are interested in doers, people who are self-motivated to accomplish things. So the students who succeed in getting into graduate school, of course this won't surprise you, are the students who say, Matt, I have a couple of ideas for research projects. I'd like to get the help of your team to accomplish these projects, and would you supervise me in the process? We've done a lot of interesting work with those students. We've presented interesting papers at conferences, we've published things, those students are the ones who have a great deal of success getting in graduate school, even if their GPAs are on a 4.0, because it shows that they are self-motivated, self-starter, that they can really, that some other professor will profit greatly from their research. Now, in working with graduate students, one of the things I've noticed is, for example, in graduate school there are teaching assistantships and research assistantships. And that's how graduate students can help pay for their graduate school experience. So teaching assistantships at some universities are to the point, especially at your more research institutions, teaching assistantships are where the professor gets paid for the course that the graduate student actually does all the teaching for, but at a much reduced level of pay. So the professor is free to continue to write books and do their research papers, and it's the graduate student actually that is the one who does all of the work in the course. Okay, so what the graduate student usually gets is bonus pay towards tuition, and sometimes tuition is even waived if they're teaching a sufficient number of courses. Likewise, there are research assistantships, and research assistantships is where the student has tuition waivers, or like if you're paying $25,000 a year of in-state tuition, they'll knock it down to $25,000 a year of out-of-state tuition, they'll knock it down to $3,000 a year in-state tuition, right? It's massive savings if you are helping if you're following through on your assignment to help this professor for research. So therefore, with research assistantships, and they're usually only at your pretty big major universities, although there are some exceptions to that, that's where research experience comes in, where you've shown that you can handle a research project, that you can work independently on research under the supervision of a more seasoned colleague. And so that's something to keep in mind, is that's where research experience comes in. Now, the reason I wanted to touch on that is because there are many types of graduate programs where they don't do research, or if the faculty do, they certainly don't involve students in it. Therefore, for those types of programs, having research experience is not what they're looking for. They want other things on the cake you're dishing to them of your application. They want other kind of toppings, they want other kind of flavors than research experience. So we'll touch on these again in a minute, but there are like certain clinical social work programs, clinical mental health programs, very applied programs. They're not interested as much in research, if at all in research. What they're interested in is, can you actually do the work in the field? It's like the same idea that, are you competent to direct yourself and can go out in the world and get things done with minimal supervision? And they want that like in the clinical world, like a researcher wants you to be, if you're going for a more researchy type degree, that you can come into a lab or into a research program and take over part of it with minimal oversight and supervision. So if you're interested in applied degrees, research often doesn't help. It would behoove you, and I would suggest very strongly, that you find out, like you can research various programs and find out what they want. I've noticed that research experience, for example, doesn't help students get into UVU's social work program, but research experience helps a little bit with people getting into BYU's social work program. So research doesn't help very much for students getting into the University of Utah's social work program, but it helps a little bit for those who want to get into UVU's clinical mental health counseling program. So again, look at the roles the students play at those particular colleges, right? Those particular universities, and find out where does research actually help. And so for those of you who realize this after you've graduated and you want to go to a more researchy profession, then there are some faculty that will work with former students. If you were to come into mine, oftentimes there's one student or two who graduated a year or two ago who come back later and go, oh crap, it turns out I need this research experience. I've got an idea for a project, Draper, would you supervise me? Now you notice the way I keep phrasing that. They don't come to me and say, hey Draper, use me as your research bitch. Because that's not very interesting. That doesn't get them very far. If it's I have an idea for research, then that gets them farther. Okay? So just sitting and entering data to the computer isn't a very impressive line on a Vita. Sitting and entering data on a spreadsheet or on a statistical software on a study that you devised and are doing under supervision, that's extremely impressive. So even if it's a simple study, it still shows that you've got thinking proactively, you're self-organized, you're self-directed, right? So that looks much better. Now, so I'm going to touch on a third issue, and that's work experience, or experience in the field. Now, this field experience, it varies depending on the type of thing you're going into. For some branches of psychology, your work experience is things like teaching and research experience, because that's what psychologists and the research arm do. They do a lot of research and they teach some classes. So, welcome back, Ninja. And so that's your work experience. You'll notice, some of you know that we have a pedagogy class, meaning a learning how to teach psychology class here at UVU. And that is for those who would like to be educators in some capacity later on. And so they want a class on how to teach and experience teaching under supervision while they're undergraduates. And so that's great for those who want a more teaching-oriented profession, whether they want to teach in high schools or universities, etc. It's very helpful. And so the other is, of course, research experience, which we've touched on. Some people genuinely enjoy research and they would like to do it professionally. So therefore, the research experience isn't just to get them into graduate school, it's also because that's what they want to do for a living. And that's very valid and very important. Now, when it comes to clinical experience, it's a little tough because undergraduates in general cannot do clinical work directly. They're not licensed to do therapy. And so they do paraprofessional work. Paraprofessional means related to the professions of clinical work, but not necessarily clinical work. And so one of the nice things about living here in Utah is we have more treatment centers per capita than I think anywhere else in the country. It's just remarkable. You can throw a rock and hit a treatment center. So many of our students will work in like a residence treatment center for boys or a treatment center for girls or for adults, etc. And they'll do so as case managers or coaches or frontline staff. Even though they're not therapists, they get into the profession and do very counseling-like things or very therapy-like things without actually doing the kinds of things that require a license. So there is an exception to that I would like you all to consider. In fact, some of you may have. Is if you're watching this video earlier in your career and you're interested in clinical work, the university, in fact our college department offers what's called a SUD-C. A SUD-C is a Substance Use Disorder Counselor Certificate program. And so many of the credits count towards the psychology major, and it requires internships and practica and everything else. But it's a way to certify as a type of counselor as an undergraduate. So for example, at a clinic where I work at night, some nights, we've had 2 colleagues recently who were SUD-Cs, and their scope of practice is very limited. They don't do the kind of intensive, in-depth psychotherapies that some of the other people do. But when it comes to coaching people and really getting people and joining them in the horrors of trauma of substance use and addiction, then they're very good at that. We've been very fortunate to have some gifted SUD-Cs work for us at the clinic, and so work with us at the clinic. And so I would encourage you to try that, because it's a way to get clinical experience, of actual documentable, certified clinical experience as an undergraduate. And that's quite a rare opportunity. If they had had such things back when I was in college 100 years ago, that's the route I would have taken. So I could have had documented clinical experience by the time I get into graduate school. So work experience can be very important, and some programs, especially the applied programs, tend to emphasize work experience and volunteer experience, because sometimes you do cool stuff and you don't get paid for it, but it's still cool stuff. Community volunteer, serving various organizations. Now, that ranks far more highly to many service or applied programs than research does. And so that's something to keep in mind. I've noticed with some counseling programs, like actual applied experience matters more than research. In clinical mental health and social work, marriage and family therapy, that those kinds of real life experiences are more highly weighted on the application than research is. So that's something to keep in mind, is work-related experience. Now, another issue I'd like to touch on are letters of recommendation, because those are often ranked quite highly in most types of programs, whether they're applied programs or more academic programs. So again, applied programs are more about serving, learning technical and practical skills, and then academic programs are more research-based. So regardless of the type of program, letters of recommendation matter, but there are good letters of recommendation and then there are bad letters of recommendation. And I'm going to engage in some black and white thinking, not because this is actually the case, but to give kind of an extreme example, or to get you thinking about these examples. So here is a bad letter. Dear Graduate Director, I have known Miss Betty for the past 2 years. She was a student in 2 of my classes. She earned high marks. Sincerely, Matthew R. Draper, PhD, HSPP, etc., ad nauseum, Professor, Utah Valley University psychologist. Okay, that's a terrible letter. That you may as well just shoot that student's application in the face and be done with it. And some of you may be saying, but Matt, that sounds like a good letter because you acknowledge that the student showed up and that they earned hard marks. No, that's a terrible letter. That is less than the minimum of what you would demand of a graduate student. Okay, just earning high marks. Does it show that I know Miss Betty? Does it show that I know anything about her? Can I speak to any examples of why it is I think she would be a good researcher or a good clinician or just a good graduate student? No, quite the contrary. I said nothing about that at all because I don't know. Okay, so every year at graduate application times, I'll get emails from students saying, Dr. Draper, you were my favorite professor, and I've taken 3 of your classes. Would you please write me a letter of recommendation? And I don't know who the hell this student is. And I am actually very good with names and faces, but people need to introduce themselves and talk to me in class or after class or things for me to know them. Wallflowers who just sit there in silence earning their high GPAs but don't relate to other people are extremely hard to write letters of recommendation for. And so I will tell them, I say, no, I can't actually write you a good letter. All I can say is that you're unobtrusive, practically invisible, and earned very high marks on your assignments. And the students will come back to me and say, that's great, please, that would be so helpful. And I'm like, no, it's not. That is not actually helpful. That's a bad letter of recommendation. But they think it's good because I mentioned that they got good grades. Well, of course the graduate school knows they got good grades. The graduate school requires copies of your transcripts. You know what I mean? They know what your GPA is. Letters of recommendation are for something extremely different. Okay? And letters of recommendation can, in my experience, can save students who have otherwise less than ideal GPAs. Like if an ideal GPA for a given program is a 3.75 and a student applies with a 3.4, but they've got amazing letters of recommendation, they have a better chance of getting in than somebody who has a 4.0 GPA with middling letters of recommendation. Okay, letters of recommendation at most institutions matter. So here's a good letter of recommendation. Dear Program Director, I have known Miss Betty for the past 2 years in capacity as a teacher in 3 of her courses and as a colleague and an indispensable colleague on my research team. When Miss Betty joined our research team, we were having a conundrum about how to take up and tackle a particular project. Miss Betty asked if she could make that project her own. Under my supervision, she did the following things. She accomplished it in this way, and here's what the outcome was, okay? That's a good academic letter of recommendation. I parked a Mercedes car right there on the letter. You know, it's a gorgeous vehicle, right? Now, what does CAR stand for, Matt? You're using it as a metaphor. Yes, I know. CAR stands for circumstance, action, and result. Circumstance means the circumstance under which you came to know the student. The circumstance of the problems or issues that were going on. Action is what the student did to solve the problem or to assist with the problem, and result is what the outcome was. So with Miss Betty, for example, here's the conundrum we had in our research team. Action, Miss Betty stepped in. Result, we got the problem solved, right? Think of that same thing clinically, like at work, where like I write letters of recommendation for my staff as they apply for various levels of training as well. And it will be, you know, dear graduate coordinator, I have known Mr. Jericho for 4 years now as a supervisor, as his clinical supervisor at X and Y Clinic. In the time I have known Jericho, so that's a circumstance, and then what I do is I outline all of the actions that I saw him undertake for the staff, for the administration, for the clients, and the various results I've seen from his work. The more cars your letter writers, whether they're colleagues of yours professionally, supervisors, employers, colleagues of yours professionally, or professors in your classes, the more cars they can park on your letter, the better letter it is. And so just the one paragraph, yeah, they earned A's, sincerely, that's a terrible letter, right? It's as bad as saying, this student sucks, don't admit them. So good letters have multiple cars where the professors can talk about, and your supervisors can talk about the circumstances by which they know you and the problems that are involved in the life, the actions that you undertook, and the results coming out of it, okay? So that is a good letter of recommendation. If the professor can't write that, then don't ask them for a letter. If your supervisor can't write that, don't ask them for a letter, okay? So now the last thing I'd like to talk about in general is standardized testing, the GRE and tests like that, okay? So the GRE stands for the Graduate Record Examination. It's like the ACTs or SATs for college graduates. It has 3 sections: verbal, quantitative, and analytic. Verbal tests just what it sounds like it tests: word fluency, antonyms, synonyms, understanding the rules and order of language, right? Reading comprehension, vocabulary. Quantitative is usually algebra and some calculus, some geometry, right? Some trig. It's very much, can you reason and think through things numerically. And then the qualitative section, the analytic section, is where they give you a writing prompt and you write out an answer to the best of your ability in a short period of time. And so those are then graded by professional evaluators. So the programs that require the GRE, one of the things that you need to look for is how much do they emphasize the GRE. There are some graduate programs, I kid you not, where before they'll even look at the rest of your application, they take a metric of your GPA and your GRE, and then if that score combined is a certain level or higher, then they'll read the rest of your application. But if it's not, they don't even read your application. And so I've had various students through the years who got middling grades on the GRE, but they have a high GPA, and they were still able to get interviews. I've had some students who had middling GPA, like a 3.4, but had high GREs, and they were able to get interviews. So those two things at some graduate programs, those two things put together can bump you up into the point where the admissions committee will read the rest of your application. And so at the same time, though, there are some programs that don't even require standardized testing. I am not actually a fan of standardized testing. I know I took the GRE before many of you were born, In fact, the year I took the GRE was the last year it was administered paper and pencil. I'm that old. It's before it was even computerized. And one of the things that I learned is I could learn about how the GRE is written and how it's constructed, and by using that mindset, instead of mastering content, I could greatly increase my GRE score, and so that's what I did. It's not that I have an extremely competent vocabulary or I'm a good quantitative reasoner or that my qualitative reasoning is super on point. Is that I got how the test works and how the test operates. And I've noticed my students who get into that, even though now it's computerized, there are certain philosophies, certain theories behind the way the GRE is constructed, and by mastering those, then you can start to eliminate possible distractors on your exam, and you're more likely to get the right answer. So I was able to grossly inflate my own GRE score. A few other students who have done that have grossly inflated theirs. I'm not a fan of the GRE. It's not being used the way it was designed to be used. The way the GRE was designed to be used was as just a metric, not this GPA plus GRE equals whether or not we interview or not. That was never the purpose of the GRE. I actually got to interview and talk to a couple of the designers of the original GRE many years ago, and they were very frustrated. They're like, this isn't what we had in mind. In fact, some graduate programs say, unless you score at this score or higher, we won't even read your application. Well, that's a problem though, because for those of you that have taken a statistics class, that creates what's called a restriction of range, where if I have this scatter plot that's a vaguely positive correlation between GRE and academic success, and believe me, it's a hugely broad scatter plot. It barely coheres as a correlation, meaning you can't tell by looking at it that there's a correlation there. And so it has minimal validity in that sense. But then when you offer a restriction of range, when you say, okay, we'll only look at this score or higher, then what was maybe slightly a line of scatter, it just becomes a clump. Meaning there's now no more relationship between GRE score and academic success in graduate school because of the restriction of range. The correlation drops to 0. And so it really frustrated, many of them have since passed away, but frustrated the many of the designers of the GRE, because that's not what the GRE was designed for. So if and when we open a clinical mental health counseling master's program at UVU, we will not require the GRE. I just don't have any faith in it. And so, or any other standardized test. But there are many programs who still do, especially in psychology. Because remember, what sets psychology apart from clinical mental health counseling and social work and marriage and family therapy is psychologists measure things. That's what we do. We measure personality and IQ and what's your type and what's your Gryffindor house. All of that comes out of psychological methodology, right? We measure things. And so therefore many of my colleagues have great faith in measurement. It's faith I have lost, but many of them still hold on to it, so therefore they still strongly value the GRE and exams like it. So be sure to look at your programs that you're applying for. Look at the ones that require the GPA. Do your research as to how highly ranked the GRE is, and then you know how much time you need to spend studying the GRE. You know, as I said, studying the GRE, not studying for the GRE. So, yeah, there is some content if you're studying the GRE that you'll need to master, but rather than just going over bucket loads and bucket loads of information trying to retain it all, you will, by studying the GRE itself and how it's constructed and how it's made, you can learn what kinds of information they're after, and that makes your study far more efficient. So, now that I've covered kind of broad advice on getting into graduate school, let me touch on interviews for a minute. Now, granted, there are some programs that don't even interview. You look at your materials and you're either in or out. You don't have to worry about interviewing. Many programs, though, still rely on the interview process as one of, and in fact, in some places, the most important metric for whether or not you're going to get into their program. Here's the thing, though. It's going to be very hard for me to convince you of the truthfulness of this. I'm still going to try, and I'm going to do so very briefly. The interview process is designed to serve two purposes. As the person being evaluated, you are very, very aware of one, and that is their evaluation of you. What you often forget, though, is your evaluation of them, okay? That some graduate programs will not be a good fit for you. Some graduate programs will not meet your needs professionally, interpersonally, etc. as you're going through them. They just won't, and that's something that you need to be aware of. as you're interviewing, ask the graduate students who are helping with the interview, when it's your turn to ask questions, ask them about what their daily life is like, what their experience of the relationships between the students are like, what the relationships between the students and faculty are like, what the relationships between the faculty are like. So as I was interviewing for doctoral programs many years ago, the one program where I didn't ask those questions, ironically, was the place I ended up going. And had I known the answers to those questions, I don't think I would have gone there. Because the students didn't like each other, the faculty didn't like the students, and the faculty hated each other. And that very much got in the way of my academic success and very nearly derailed my career there as a graduate student. And so, like, I can remember walking into faculty meeting just in time to see one professor throw a chair at another professor. Like, apart from BYU, I've never seen that kind of grossly unprofessional behavior amongst faculty. So it was very startling. And like, imagine you're trying to put together a dissertation committee. It's a very important committee, right? Without this committee, you do not graduate with your doctoral degree. And in some programs, so like your thesis committee, if you do not graduate unless your master's thesis committee is working all together, where I would literally have professors say, yes, I'll be on your committee, but if I'm on your committee, so-and-so can't be because I refuse to work with that jerk, okay? The problem is, what I was researching, there are only 3 faculty in the department who are competent to talk about it or to be on the committee, and all 3 of them hated each other. You get where I'm coming from? I could have saved myself a lot of drama by asking those questions in the interview. And so, ask those kinds of questions. How do the students get along with each other? How do the students and faculty get along? How do the faculty get along with each other? And if it's a chaotic, war-torn program, you probably don't want to go there, right? You need to be evaluating them as much as they need to evaluate you. So while you are interviewing, the goal here seems like an impossible one, and that is to be natural, to be authentic, to be honest, and diplomatic at the same time. It sounds like I'm asking you to do the impossible. It's not. There's still an organization around called Toastmasters, for example, where you learn how to shake hands and how to speak from a pulpit and things that we so hate doing. How can you be a charming and engaging conversationalist in the 15 minutes you have to interview with somebody? That skill, especially for those of you who are interested in going into the therapeutic programs, will serve you immensely. How can you just sit and be natural and authentic and real while you're being scrutinized and evaluated? And you can practice it in advance. So I've had students come in and sign up for time during my office hours and ask me to interview them like they're interviewing for graduate school. And they're quite surprised because my interviewing style isn't a sit and grill you mercilessly with questions and try to track you and trick you and just trick questions. And I don't do that. I just sit and shoot the bull. But then what I do is I give feedback if here's how you came across. You know what I mean? And because I tend to like everybody, my feedback isn't necessarily the most helpful. At the same time, though, I have a general sense for what my colleagues tend to look for. And so that feedback can be more helpful. Okay, so there is my all too brief advice and perspective on graduate schools. I've helped a lot of students get into graduate school. I used to be the director of a graduate program. I'll probably be the director of a graduate program again. I get it. I know what graduate school is like. Now, there are 4 ways to become a therapist. This just made noise at me and I don't know why. There are 4 ways to become a therapist, okay? Clinical mental health counseling, clinical social work, marriage and family therapy, and clinical counseling psychology. Now, we have the SUDC program, which is kind of down here. It's a certification, not a license. Insurance companies won't reimburse for it. But Addictions Clinic can still put you to work, and you can do some counseling work there. That doesn't lead to like a license where you can practice independently and make a living wage. So it's a great job for an undergraduate. SUDCs are. So clinical mental health counseling is very, very specialized on therapy. Clinical mental health counseling programs there's only one in the state of Utah. Well, there's 2 now, Westminster's, so there are 2. Westminster College and the University of Utah have one. Hopefully UVU will have one soon. And what clinical mental health counseling is everything is about counseling. Like, yeah, of course they have their therapy methods or counseling methods, counseling techniques courses, assessment, mental health assessment courses, etc. All of that you'd expect. What's surprising to students is when they get into like their research methods class, it's research methods of counseling. Like, how do you research a particular new technique? How do you set up an intervention program and then research how it's working in your clinic? Like, everything is about counseling. It's very, very focused and very specialized. It is usually a very intense 2-year program or a somewhat more relaxed 3-year program. You need to accrue as part of your work 1,000 hours through the course of your degree. You usually have about a year and a half to accrue 1,000 hours of direct service, meaning that you are in clinics, in supervision, seeing clients, running groups, seeing couples if you can get supervision for that, working with families if you can get supervision with that there are a lot of things that you are doing that count towards that, and they're all very therapy focused. So you need 1,000 hours. It's all about counseling. It's all about getting that done, okay? So clinical mental health counseling is usually a very applied approach. They usually want a certain, relatively high GPA or higher to, vet that you're not a a high drama student, meaning a high need, high demand student, that you can succeed academically on your own without constant tutoring from the faculty. And work experience or real life experience applies. Now, I hope to get to work and real life experience examples here in a minute. I don't know how much time I have. Let me check. Ooh, okay. Clinical social work. I don't have much time. Clinical social work, the focus is also very applied. Okay, they tend to want more real life experience, more work experience, things like that. Research is less emphasized. GPA is still relatively important. Clinical social work is clinical social workers are more broadly trained in other non-therapy things than clinical mental health counselors are. Clinical social workers, for example, like when I have a clinical social work intern in my clinic, running and getting coffee, sweeping the floor, sitting and shooting the bull with the front desk admin, all of that, insofar as they're in the building or doing things related to the building, everything counts as direct service hours. So they also need 1,000 hours, but it doesn't have to be therapy hours, unlike the clinical mental health counselors. But the clinical social workers also have classes on things like policy and procedure and how to get grants and how to be in a nonprofit organization. So although my CMHC interns are better prepared to do therapy, my clinical social work students are better prepared to do paperwork. Like, if I have a grant that I need to apply for to keep my building open, I can look at my social work students and say, hey, remember that class you never thought you'd use? I need you to use that class, and I need you to write this grant, right? We need to meet with the city council to make an argument for expanding the license of our practice. Would you please write that proposal? Like, CMHC students don't have any classes on that. They don't understand how politics work or anything like that, but our clinical social work students do. So out of the gate, clinical mental health counselors are better prepared than clinical social workers are for therapy. However, the clinical social workers have a variety of activities they can do, and clinical mental health counselors don't have that skill. Now we have marriage and family therapy. Marriage and family therapy is as clinically focused as clinical mental health, right? Social work is here, clinical mental health, marriage and family therapy are equal in their clinical focus. As is in the title, right? With marriage and family therapists, they are required to meet with couples and families. In fact, half of their hours in graduate school and half of their hours after they graduate and until they license have to be couples and families. They call them relational hours. This is a constant headache for me as a supervisor, because 90% of the clients who appear for therapy want individual therapy. And even if they come to a family-oriented clinic, will often show up individually because the rest of the family members won't show up. So therefore, it's been a headache for some of my interns, because even though they're assigned families and assigned couples and asked to work with other individuals and invite their families to come in, because to marriage and family therapists, everything is relational, and they have a lot of good data to back them up there, that the relational hours can be a stumbling block for some people. Now, I also want to emphasize that for other people, it's not. Okay, they have no problem getting relational hours at all. So, like, I have 2 marriage and family therapy interns right now. One of them is so far down, she's not getting many relational hours. She's really struggling. But I've got another intern who is well over the number of relational hours he needs for the year, like way, way over. So there are reasons for that in terms of the student's approach to relational hours. One is very good at creating relational hours opportunities of inviting in the spouse of a client, inviting in the family of a client, you know what I mean, doing those kinds of things, as well as the families and couples he's assigned. The other one tends not to do that. When she's working with an individual, she just works with an individual, and she expects the clinic to give her more families and more couples. But when I do that, then the individual client often shows up alone anyway. So it's based on what the clinic can do, what the student's approach is, whether or not relational hours are a problem. Like clinical mental health counseling, marriage and family therapy also requires 1,000 hours, and they also have to be therapy hours. No earning hours for doing photocopies, right? Now, the other is clinical and counseling psychology. Now, I've saved that one for last because that one, whereas the other three are master's programs, and that's where your license is, even if you get a doctorate in counseling, even if you get a doctorate in marriage and family therapy, you still practice and your license is at the master's level. If you're a psychologist, then your license is at the doctorate level, meaning you don't practice at the master's level but as a psychologist. You practice at the doctoral level as a psychologist. And so, whereas these programs, excuse me, I will take just a few more minutes of your time. Whereas the master's programs are relatively similar in terms of the kinds of GPAs, the kinds of GREs, the kind of work or research experience they want. Doctoral programs are a different animal. They, like, to give you an idea, Texas at Austin, for their doctoral program in counseling psychology, they had 328 applicants for 8 seats, right? There are many master's programs in counseling throughout the Midwest where they barely get enough applicants to fill all of their seats. You know what I mean? That it's that the application rates are just that different. So for doctoral programs, they want the very high GPA, they want the very high GRE, they want you to have a lot of research experience. In fact, actually have published articles, presented research at conferences, etc. will help set you apart. And then some applied work experience as well to show that you have some kind of talent or skill with working in this particular field. So the average acceptance rates of many master's programs is on the order of 50%, sometimes even 60%. But the average acceptance rate of doctoral programs is on the order of 3% to 7%, depending on where you are in the country. So if you have the high GPA, high GRE, etc., you're just like another 100 applicants, right? But they've only got 8 seats. And so for doctoral programs, you need to do these extra things to really set yourself apart. Now, there are some hidden gems in the doctoral field where there are programs nobody thinks about, nobody talks about, they're there, and they're not as overinflated in their own expectations for what their students should come in. Like BYU has a doctoral program in counseling, and it's actually in their College of Education. And it's kind of like an old school psychology / old school counseling psychology doctoral program. It's really weird. Very few people know about it. I love the faculty there. It's a good, weird program out in the middle of Provo, Utah. You know what I mean? It's just strange. So there are other hidden gems. Indiana State University, for example, has quite a remarkably high-quality PsyD program. So a PsyD program is a PhD that's been pared down just to the minimal requirements to meet APA accreditation standards. So they sacrifice several, almost a year's worth of classes on history and philosophy, etc., of psychology. And so it saves about a year of your doctoral work at the expense of deep academic rigor. So PsyDs don't become professors. They're not prepared or trained to do that. But they can become clinical psychologists, and that's what they're trained to do. And so, again, nobody applied. Who would think to go to Terre Haute, Indiana? You know, it's famous for its 7 rotten smells. But it's a good PsyD program. And so there are hidden gems out there in the world that you can research up where they don't get many applications, but they still have a solid accredited program. And that's some advice I would give you. So that's Draper's advice on graduate school in less than an hour. I wish we had time in class to talk about this face-to-face so I could answer your questions. And thank you very much for those of you who submitted questions and the small handful of you who have actually watched these videos. I really appreciate it. Thank you, guys.